What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a fun Divinity lore video about none other than Chaos, the demon god. Assuming you've only played Divinity Original Sin 2, you might have some questions about the world of Divinity in general. Chaos is actually involved in a ton of stuff. He's across several games, so I'm going to try to keep this as much just about him as humanly possible. But because he's so intertwined with things on a background level, it's kind of hard to talk about him sometimes without also mentioning a lot of other stuff. So because of that, there are going to be quite a few spoilers just like everywhere and around. So if you don't want those, maybe don't watch this. And I mean for like several Divinity games, like the original Sin series, Divine Divinity, a little bit of Beyond Divinity, Divinity 2, so just a lot of them. With that in mind, you might have heard about the Seven, obviously, as they are the big main focus of Divinity Original Sin 2. What you might not have known, because you're not me and have played all of these games extensively and just a huge nerd about lore, there wasn't 7, there was 8. If you're unaware, and this is the spoilery part, when the 7 gods became gods of Rivellon, they discovered the Veil of Source that protected Rivellon from the outside void, shall we say, after Fane discovered it. And when the Eternals discovered that, 7 of the lords, or 8 as it actually turns out, rebelled against their king, who became the God King later, and basically stole that Veil of Source for themselves and cast out the rest of the Eternal race, thus cementing their place in the world as gods who had risen up from the race of Eternals. Now, prior to Original Sin 2, it was thought that Chaos was a precursor god to the 7, such as Astarte or a couple other gods I mention in my Gods Divinity Original Sin 2 Doesn't Tell You About video, as there are actually several more than even just this. Now, as you might imagine, and the title of this video probably told you, with the 8th Eternal that you've now just found out about who stole Source from the Veil, what happened from there? Why isn't he mentioned later on? What happened with him? Well, that is because he became Chaos. So no one seems to know what his actual name was. He is literally referred to as either the Lord of Chaos or just straight up Chaos. Whereas the other gods went on to create their respective races in their own image. For whatever reason, it would seem Chaos took some weird offense to this, and as a result, he chose to create demons. So from here, Chaos and his legions of demons fight the other 7 gods, until eventually the 7 and Chaos left the mortal realm, shall we say. And keep in mind, this predates like history, basically, for the lore. So they essentially finally decided to leave the mortal plane and traveled to an area between the Hall of Echoes and Rivellon. So the Hall of Echoes being the place you go when you die, basically, and, the actual living world. Now, from here, Chaos, in order to keep doing this, actually created his own realm entirely, known as Tartarus. This is the home realm of the actual demons. So, throughout several of the games, you might be under the impression that the plane of Nemesis is actually where the demons come from, and that's incorrect. So, if you've played Beyond Divinity, you would have found out that Nemesis is actually the home plane of a sentient race called the Renari, who have their own god, Ron, who created them, which is a whole thing. They basically invaded and took over Nemesis as a bit of a power area. The actual demon's home realm is called Tartarus. Now, being trapped out here with the other 7 after they drug him into this place, because Chaos didn't go willingly outside of the mortal plane. The 7 left the mortal plane, Rivellon, and drug Chaos with them, and that's why Chaos then, made Tartarus and everything. Now, from here, Chaos continued to, spread chaos. Now, there are 2 instances specifically that we know of that Chaos was either physically or spiritually in Rivellon in force. Those are in 100 AD, which, to be clear, is about 100 years after Divinity Original Sin 1, and Chaos, it's left very vague right here, so we don't know exactly what happened, but Chaos came into the world with his armies and was driven back entirely by the dwarves and their armies. They took care of literally all of it. 500-ish years later, in 611 AD, somehow or another, a group called the League of the Damned summoned Chaos again, and this time they were actually largely successful. They had driven the 7 races back, and they had pretty much won at this point. They were on the verge of actually winning. And it was at this point the Seven sacrificed them in some way. It's, again, left a little vague as exactly what happens here. Some instances you'll hear that the Council of Seven sacrificed themselves, which is not the actual Seven. And then in other cases, you'll hear the Seven actually sacrificed their physical forms somehow. But then, like I mentioned earlier, they'd already left the mortal plane. So this part is a little vague. But suffice to say, there was some sort of divine sacrifice, which was ultimately responsible for putting down the second invasion of Chaos. Very importantly, in this second invasion, Chaos had with him the Sword of Lies. The Sword of Lies is integral to the story of Divinity, the first Divinity game. So the Sword of Lies held a piece of Chaos's soul himself. After being beat the first time, Chaos started thinking of alternative plans in case he was actually defeated. So what happened is when he was beaten the second time, his sword remained on the battlefield, the Sword of Lies, which held a piece of his soul. So from here, the sword is eventually taken back to a place called Stormfist Castle. There's a whole thing with this guy named Ralph where he was trapped in like a prison underneath Stormfist Castle where Ralph was possessed and then taken over and died. It didn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things and is ultimately pretty unimportant. But the main crux of it is that the Sword of Lies has been lying in a vault underneath Stormfist Castle. Now, at some point while the sword was under Stormfist Castle, it came in contact with a young boy named Janus Farrell, the heir to the dukedom of the area. So when his father was assassinated, which as it turns out happened to be because Janus himself, after touching the sword, became possessed by the powerful spirit within, which came to be known as the Demon of Lies, the piece of Chaos's soul that was in the sword. And ultimately, Janus had his father assassinated, thus becoming the Duke of Farrell, despite only being 12 at the time. But again, being possessed by the Demon of Lies, so basically just looked 12 and was actually like a full-grown demon, so to speak. Now from here, the rest of the plot of Divinity plays out, and ultimately, while the Demon of Lies, through Janus, was able to begin the ritual to completely bring Chaos back into the mortal world, was ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. This ritual consisted of putting a human infant in a ritual of some sort in which the Chaos demon, Chaos, was supposed to take it over somehow. The specifics are left vague. It's a very old game. It's from like 2002. But essentially, they were going to try to turn this infant baby into Chaos. As part of Divinity's story, the hero of that, which turns out to be none other than Lucian the Divine later on, ultimately foils this plot. However, he, while being able to stop the transfer completely of Chaos into this baby, was not in time able to actually completely stop what had happened. So unfortunately, this baby infant still became the vessel of a lot of this demon god's power. Now, as my followers probably know already, this baby later went on to become Damien. Now, Damien was ultimately raised by Lucian because Lucian was unable to do what, while terrible, would have been the smart thing to do, shall we say, and, basically kill an infant, which would be awful. Lucian decided to take the opposite route and actually try to raise this child as his own and hopefully steer it away from the course of these events. As the later events of Beyond Divinity and Divinity 2 tell us, he was unsuccessful in doing so. Before we go any further, I want to mention that Damien's state as like an avatar of Chaos or anything like that is very much so up for debate. The specifics of it in the lore are currently pretty vague. We're not 100% sure. Damien has some measure of Chaos's power inside of him. We're just not exactly sure exactly how deep that connection goes or where it could possibly go. Which, by the way, is what I am hoping the plot of Divinity 3 is actually going to be about, because I would love to see this come full circle. With that said, moving on. As Damien was being raised, he met a woman named Yagurna and fell in love with her. Yagurna was actually a member of the Black Ring, the people who basically support Chaos on Earth. They're like his mortal worshippers, shall we say. Now, Yagurna made it her mission to basically explain to Damien what he actually was. And she never actually got that far because Lucian himself caught wind of this and had her executed. But because she was executed, by Lucian, his father, it ironically enough pushed Damien into exactly what his father was trying to avoid for him, and that is, serving the god of demons, Chaos. So, at this point, all-out war begins with Damien and Lucian after Damien runs away. Now keep in mind, at this particular moment, Damien's like 15. But anyways, all-out war slowly begins with these guys. So Damien is backed up by the Black Ring, who, are obviously trying to serve him, and by proxy, their master, the god of demons. Lucian, of course, being the divine, as like basically all the military strength of the rest of the world. Now, because of Damien's age and Lucian himself's guile, shall we say, he's able to lure Damien to a void temple, and at this temple, he's able to actually banish Damien to the realm of Nemesis. And he puts some sort of like divine seal around the entire realm of Nemesis, which prevents Damien himself escaping, except unless he is accompanied or intentionally brought through that seal by a member of the Divine Order. And thus begin the events of Beyond Divinity, the second Divinity game. Now, this game, basically, a Death Knight and a Paladin become Soulforged, which means if one dies, the other dies. In Nemesis, a Paladin raids a demon's lair on Rivellon, is sent to Nemesis after the raid fails. Inside Nemesis, this Paladin is Soulforged to a Death Knight. Over the course of the game, you're trying to escape Nemesis with this Soulforged Death Knight because you play the Paladin. You manage to do this by learning about the Renari, like I mentioned earlier, and this thing called rift jumps and stuff like that, where basically you can just travel between the realms if you know how, which is something the Renari were actually masters of before being invaded by the demons. So, over the course of this adventure, you are eventually successful and you manage to leave. Now, at the end of the game, if you hadn't already figured it out yet, it turns out that the Death Knight you were Soulforged to was actually Damien himself. Now, I won't go into too much more detail than that. I actually have full story videos of Divine Divinity and Beyond Divinity and every other Divinity game in my channel if you're interested in those. So from here, Damien is real upset. Some years have passed, he is older, and instead of declaring war again, he just disappears. No one hears from him after this. The Paladin is actually... he lived, at least, the immediate confrontation between him and Damien. Damien serves as the last boss fight of actually Beyond Divinity. And presumably, this Paladin is how we know Damien escaped, because, he spread the word kind of thing. Again, Damien just disappears. Now, to be clear about the time here, Beyond Divinity takes place in 1238 AD, 4 years before Divinity Original Sin 2. So keep that in mind, because the entire events of Divinity Original Sin 2... no one hears from Damien. He's not heard of again canonically until about 1300 AD for the events of the Dragon Knight saga. Not the latest game that was made by Larian for Divinity, of course. However, it is the latest game in the timeline. Throughout this, we find out that Damien is finally ready to make his move and does so. And throughout the game is essentially basically forced back. However, he is not killed. His lover, Yagurna, was resurrected, and it winds up being killed almost immediately after that again. But Damien himself, and thus Chaos agent on Earth, shall we say, continues to be alive, with no one really knowing what his goal is after his failed attempt here, shall we say, in 1300 AD. Which is where the timeline of the games lead off, which is why I mentioned earlier, if they ever make a Divinity 3, I am going to be absolutely in love with it because I want to see the conclusion of this story. I want to see the conclusion of what happened with Damien and what happens with the god of demons, Chaos. So there you go, guys. A little long-winded, but I really hope you enjoyed it. You have to do a lot of research about this to find it because a lot of the modern games don't mention it at all, but after a ton of research, there you guys are, all the information I could give you about the god of demons, Chaos. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. The channel's growing tremendously every day. I appreciate you guys. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.